Sarah Mitchell had never been the kind of woman to make rash decisions. At 25, she lived a quiet life in Boston, teaching at the local school and caring for her ailing mother. Her days followed the same predictable pattern: wake at dawn, prepare lessons, teach children, return home, tend to mother, sleep, repeat. The routine brought comfort, but lately, it also brought a suffocating sense that life was passing her by. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1885. Her cousin Emma, who had moved to the Arizona Territory 3 years earlier, wrote with urgency. Emma's husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her alone with 2 young children and a failing ranch. She begged Sarah to come west, even if just for a few months, to help her decide whether to sell the property or fight to keep it running. Sarah's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep just 2 weeks after the letter arrived. The funeral was small, attended by neighbors who barely knew Sarah despite years of living next door. As she stood beside the fresh grave, Sarah realized she had no real ties left in Boston. Her teaching position could be filled easily. Her small apartment held no sentimental value, and her savings account contained enough money for a fresh start. The decision came to her suddenly, like lightning splitting a dark sky. She would go west, but not just to help Emma. She would stay for one night in each town along the way, experiencing the freedom she had never allowed herself. It would be her grand adventure before settling into whatever life awaited her in Arizona. 3 weeks later, Sarah stepped off the train in Denver, Colorado. The mountain air filled her lungs with a crispness she had never experienced. The town bustled with energy that made Boston seem sleepy by comparison. Cowboys rode down dusty streets, their spurs jingling with each step. Women in practical dresses hurried between shops, their faces weathered by sun and wind, but bright with determination. Sarah checked into the Grand Hotel, a modest establishment that catered to travelers heading further west. The desk clerk, a friendly man with silver hair, welcomed her warmly and recommended she visit the saloon down the street for dinner. In Boston, no respectable woman would enter such a place alone, but this was her adventure, her one chance to live without society's expectations. The Colorado saloon was exactly what Sarah had imagined from dime novels. Piano music filled the air, mixing with laughter and conversation. The smell of whiskey and tobacco created an atmosphere both foreign and exciting. Sarah chose a table in the corner, ordering beef stew and bread from a waitress who looked at her with curious but friendly eyes. She was halfway through her meal when he walked in. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the confident stride of a man comfortable in his own skin. His dark hair touched his collar, longer than fashionable back east, and his clothes bore the dust of hard travel. When he removed his hat, Sarah caught sight of eyes the color of storm clouds, scanning the room with careful attention. Their gazes met across the crowded saloon. For a moment that felt like an eternity, neither looked away. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she did not drop. Her eyes, this was her night to be bold, to be the woman she had always wondered about, but never dared to become. The stranger approached her table, his spurs creating a soft rhythm against the wooden floor. He stopped a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. His voice, when he spoke, carried the warm drawl of someone raised under western skies. "Ma'am, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I couldn't help noticing you're dining alone. This isn't always the safest place for a lady to be by herself, especially one who's clearly not from around these parts." Sarah looked up at him, noting the genuine concern in his expression rather than the predatory interest she might have expected. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors. A small scar ran along his left jawline, giving him a rugged appearance that somehow made him more attractive rather than less. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm quite capable of taking care of myself, but thank you for the warning." He smiled then, a slow grin that transformed his serious face completely. "I don't doubt that for a second, ma'am. You've got the look of someone who knows her own mind. I'm Jake Morrison, and I was wondering if you might allow me to join you for dinner. I've been riding for 3 days straight and could use some civilized conversation." Sarah considered his request. Everything about this situation went against her upbringing, her training, her careful nature. A proper Boston lady would politely decline and return to her hotel room immediately. But Sarah was no longer just a proper Boston lady. Tonight, she was an adventurer, a woman writing her own story. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Please, sit down." Jake settled into the chair with fluid grace, signaling the waitress for his own meal. As they waited for his food to arrive, they talked. Sarah learned that Jake owned a cattle ranch about 50 miles south of Denver, that he had been in town, buying supplies and meeting with potential buyers for his herd. He spoke of the challenges of ranching life with a matter-of-fact honesty that she found refreshing in return. Sarah shared her story, her mother's death, her cousin's letter, her decision to travel west. She found herself telling him about her teaching job, her quiet life in Boston, her sudden desire to experience something different before settling into whatever came next. "So this is your one night of adventure?" Jake asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "And something else? Admiration, perhaps?" "One of many, I hope," Sarah replied. "I plan to stop in every town between here and Arizona, spending one night in each, seeing what life is like beyond the classroom walls I've known for so long." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "That's a brave thing to do, especially for a woman traveling alone.
Ow.
This country can be hard on people who aren't prepared for its challenges." "Then I suppose I'll learn to be prepared," Sarah said, meeting his gaze directly. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself more attracted to this quiet cowboy than she had ever been to any man in Boston. When he offered to escort her back to her hotel, she accepted, knowing that tomorrow she would board the train and never see him again. Jake walked Sarah back to the Grand Hotel through Denver's quieting streets. The mountain air had turned crisp as night settled over the town, and Sarah pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. Their footsteps echoed softly on the wooden boardwalk, creating an intimate rhythm in the growing darkness. "Thank you for dinner," Sarah said, as they stopped in front of the hotel. "I hadn't expected to meet someone so... interesting on my first night of adventure." Jake tipped his hat, but his eyes held a seriousness that hadn't been there during dinner. "Sarah, I hope you'll be careful as you continue your journey. There are towns between here and Arizona that aren't as civilized as Denver. Some places where a woman alone might find herself in real trouble." Something in his tone made Sarah study his face more closely. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I do." Jake's jaw tightened slightly. "I've seen what can happen too. Travelers who aren't prepared for the realities of frontier life. This isn't the East, where laws are enforced and social conventions protect people. Out here, you're often on your own." Sarah felt a flutter of uncertainty, but she pushed it aside. "I've made my decision, Jake. I won't live my life in fear of what might happen." Jake nodded slowly, respect clear in his expression. "I admire that. But promise me something: if you ever find yourself in trouble, really serious trouble, you'll remember my name. Jake Morrison, Morrison Ranch, 50 miles south of Denver. Anyone in this area knows how to find me." "Why would you offer that?" "To a stranger?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking down the street where lamplight cast dancing shadows on the buildings. When he spoke, his voice was soft but earnest. "Because sometimes a person meets someone who reminds them that there's still goodness in the world. You remind me of that, Sarah Mitchell." Before Sarah could respond, Jake had touched his hat brim once more and walked away into the darkness. She stood watching until his silhouette disappeared around a corner, her heart beating faster than it should have for someone she had known for just a few hours. The next morning, Sarah boarded the train heading southwest toward New Mexico territory. As the locomotive pulled away from Denver, she pressed her face to the window, watching the mountains give way to high desert country. Part of her wondered if she had made a mistake leaving so quickly, but she reminded herself that this journey was about discovering who she could become, not dwelling on what she was leaving behind. The train stopped in a small town called Cedar Falls, just as the sun reached its highest point. Sarah had planned to continue to the next stop, but something about the way the desert stretched endlessly in all directions made her change her mind. This would be her second night of adventure. Cedar Falls was smaller than Denver, dustier, with a harder edge to its character. The main street consisted of a general store, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons, and a small hotel that looked like it had seen better days. Sarah checked into the Frontier Inn, ignoring the desk clerk's surprised look at a woman traveling alone. Her room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Through the single window, she could see the desert stretching toward distant mesas that shimmered in the afternoon heat. The vast emptiness both thrilled and intimidated her. That evening, Sarah ventured out to explore the town. The general store was run by an elderly couple who welcomed her warmly and shared local gossip over coffee and dried apple pie. They told her about the ranchers who brought cattle through town, occasional prospectors searching for silver, and the challenges of life in such an isolated place. "You be careful walking around alone after dark," the store owner's wife warned. "We get some rough characters passing through here. Not all of them are gentlemen like the folks you might be used to back east." Sarah thanked them for the warning but assured them she could take care of herself. As she walked back toward the hotel, however, she began to understand what Jake had meant about the differences between Denver and smaller frontier towns. The streets were darker here, with fewer people around, and a sense of lawlessness that made her skin prickle with unease. She was almost to the hotel when 3 men emerged from one of the saloons. They had clearly been drinking heavily, and their attention fixed on Sarah immediately. The tallest of the 3, a man with greasy hair and clothes that reeked of whiskey, stepped into her path. Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, swaying slightly, fancy lady all dressed up with nowhere to go. Sarah tried to step around him, but he moved to block her way. "Excuse me, please. I need to get back to my hotel." "Now don't be so unfriendly," the man said, reaching out to touch her arm. "We're just being neighborly, ain't we, boys?" His companions laughed, moving closer to form a semicircle around Sarah. Fear began to crawl up her spine, but she kept her voice steady. "Please let me pass. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" The tall man's smile turned ugly. "Oh, said anything about trouble. Just want to show you some Western hospitality." Sarah's mind raced. The street was empty except for the 4 of them. The hotel was still 50 yards away, and she wasn't sure she could outrun 3 men, even drunk ones. She had never felt so vulnerable, so completely out of her depth. "The lady asked you to let her pass." The voice came from the shadows near the hotel entrance. All 4 of them turned to see a figure step into the circle of lamplight. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she recognized Jake Morrison walking toward them with the same confident stride she remembered from the saloon in Denver. "This ain't your business, stranger," the tall man said. But his belligerent tone had wavered slightly. Jake stopped about 10 feet away, his hands resting casually at his sides. To Sarah, he looked completely relaxed, but something in his posture suggested he was ready for whatever might happen next. "I'm making it my business," Jake said quietly. "The lady is a friend of mine, and I don't take kindly to people bothering my friends." The 3 men looked at each other, clearly trying to decide if they wanted to press the issue. Jake waited patiently, never taking his eyes off them. Finally, the tall man spat in the dirt and gestured to his companions. "Come on, boys. This fancy lady ain't worth the trouble anyway." They stumbled away toward the other saloon, their voices loud and angry but fading into the distance. Sarah found herself trembling, though whether from fear or relief she wasn't sure. Jake approached her slowly, his storm-gray eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right? How are you here?" Sarah asked, still trying to process what had just happened. "How could you possibly be here?" Jake's expression grew serious. "I followed the train. Been riding hard for 2 days to catch up with you." He paused, looking almost embarrassed. "I couldn't stop thinking about what I said regarding the dangers you might face. I decided I'd rather look foolish for caring too much than live with regret if something happened to you." Sarah stared at Jake in the flickering lamplight, trying to understand what she was hearing. "You followed me? You left your ranch and rode for 2 days just because you were worried about my safety?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his boots before meeting her eyes again. "I know it sounds crazy. Hell, it is crazy. I've never done anything like this before in my life. But after you left Denver, I couldn't shake the feeling that you were heading into trouble." So you appointed yourself my guardian. Sarah's voice carried a mix of gratitude and irritation. I told you I could take care of myself. And how did that work out just now? Jake asked gently, gesturing toward where the three men had disappeared. Sarah's anger deflated as quickly as it had risen. The truth was, she had been terrified and completely out of her depth. Without Jake's intervention, the situation could have turned much worse. Still, his presumption that she needed rescuing stung her pride. I appreciate what you did, she said carefully. But I can't have you following me across the territory like some kind of protective shadow. This journey is supposed to be about my independence, about discovering who I am when I'm not taking care of someone else. Jake nodded slowly. I understand that. But Sarah, independence doesn't mean you have to face every danger alone. Even the most experienced travelers know when to accept help. They walked toward the hotel in silence, Sarah's mind churning with conflicted emotions. Part of her was touched by Jake's concern, by the fact that he had ridden hard for 2 days simply because he cared about her welfare. But another part resented the implication that she was too naive or helpless to handle the challenges of frontier life. There's something else, Jake said as they reached the hotel steps. Something I should tell you about Cedar Falls. Sarah looked at him questioningly. This town has a reputation for being unfriendly to strangers, especially women traveling alone. Those 3 men tonight weren't just random troublemakers. They're part of a gang that's been causing problems throughout this area for months. The local sheriff is either too scared or too corrupt to do anything about them. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. How do you know all this? Make it my business to know about the places where I might need to drive cattle for market, Jake explained. Information like that can mean the difference between a profitable drive and losing everything, including your life. Sarah sank down onto the hotel steps, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the reality of what she had gotten herself into. In Boston, the greatest danger she faced was catching cold from walking in the rain without proper protection. Here she could have been seriously hurt or worse, and no one would have even known where to look for her. Jake sat down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Sarah, I'm not trying to talk you out of your journey. What you're doing takes real courage, but maybe you could use a traveling companion, at least for the more dangerous stretches. You're offering to abandon your ranch to escort me across the territory? Sarah asked incredulously. My foreman can handle things for a few weeks, Jake said. It's not the busy season, and I've been thinking about scouting new markets anyway. This would give me a good excuse to explore some areas I've been curious about. Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, trying to read his true motivations. Why would you do that? We barely know each other. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the star-filled sky above them. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. My wife died 3 years ago, he said simply. Cholera outbreak that swept through our area. We'd only been married 2 years, but she was. She was the kind of woman who made everything brighter just by being in the room. After she died, I threw myself into work, convinced myself that the ranch was all I needed. Sarah felt her heart constrict at the pain in his voice. Meeting you reminded me that there's more to life than just existing from day to day, Jake continued. You've got that same brightness about you, that same spirit of adventure that my wife had. Maybe I'm being selfish, but I'd like to be part of your adventure if you'll have me. The honesty in his words moved Sarah deeply. She had been thinking of him as a stranger interfering with her plans. But now she saw him as a lonely man who had recognized something special in their brief encounter and was brave enough to act on it. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. I could travel with you to Arizona, making sure you reach your cousin safely. Along the way, you could still have your adventures, still discover who you are away from Boston. The only difference would be that you'd have backup if situations like tonight arise again. Sarah considered his offer. The logical part of her mind recognized the wisdom in having an experienced guide through unfamiliar territory. The romantic part of her was intrigued by the possibility of spending more time with this mysterious cowboy who had already risked so much for her safety. But there was also the matter of propriety. Traveling alone with a man she had known for less than a week would be scandalous by Boston standards. Then again, she had already left Boston's standards behind when she stepped off that train in Denver. "People will talk," she said finally. Jake smiled slightly. "Let them talk. Out here, survival matters more than gossip. My cousin Emma will have questions about why I'm arriving with a male escort. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Jake said. "For now, the important thing is making sure you get there safely." Sarah looked at him sitting beside her in the lamplight, this man who had already shown more genuine care for her well-being than anyone back in Boston ever had. The practical voice in her head warned her that accepting his offer might complicate her journey in unexpected ways. But her heart was already giving her a different answer. "All right," she said finally. "Can travel with me to Arizona, but I have conditions." Jake nodded eagerly. "Name them." "This is still my adventure," Sarah said firmly. "I make the decisions about where we stop and what we do. You're along for protection and guidance, not to take over my journey." "Agreed. And if at any point I decide I want to continue alone, you'll respect that decision and return to your ranch." Jake hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Agreed." Finally, Sarah said, standing up and smoothing her skirts, "We maintain separate rooms and proper decorum. I may be having an adventure, but I'm still a lady." Jake stood as well, touching the brim of his hat in that gesture she was already beginning to find endearing. "Wouldn't have it any other way, ma'am." As Sarah climbed the hotel steps, she couldn't help but smile. Her one night of adventure in Cedar Falls had turned into something much more complex and potentially dangerous than she had planned. But somehow, that only made the prospect more exciting. Sarah woke to the sound of Jake's voice outside her hotel room window, talking quietly with someone in the courtyard below. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the desert sky in shades of pink and gold. She dressed quickly in her most practical traveling clothes and went downstairs to find Jake waiting in the hotel lobby with 2 horses and a pack mule loaded with supplies. "I thought we were taking the train," Sarah said, eyeing the animals with uncertainty. Jake shook his head. "The train only stops in the bigger towns. If you want to experience the real frontier, we need to travel the back roads. Besides, there are places I want to show you that no railroad will ever reach." Sarah had ridden horses in Boston, but only gentle mares in controlled environments. These animals looked different, leaner, more alert, with an intelligence in their eyes that spoke of lives spent navigating challenging terrain. "The bay mare is yours," Jake said, indicating a beautiful brown horse with a black mane. "Her name's Stella. She's got good trail sense and a smooth gait. Won't give you any trouble as long as you treat her right." Sarah approached Stella cautiously, letting the horse sniff her hand before stroking her neck. The mare whickered softly, seeming to approve of her new rider. "What about supplies?" Sarah asked, looking at the pack mule's loaded panniers. "Food for a week, camping gear, medical supplies, and emergency equipment," Jake replied efficiently. "We'll resupply in towns when we can, but out here you always prepare for the unexpected." They rode out of Cedar Falls as the sun climbed higher, following a dusty trail that wound through sagebrush and scattered juniper trees. Sarah had expected to feel awkward or frightened on horseback in such wild country, but instead she found herself exhilarated by the freedom of movement and the vast openness stretching in every direction. Jake proved to be an excellent guide and companion. He pointed out landmarks, taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated water sources, and shared stories of the various Indian tribes that had called this land home for generations. His knowledge seemed endless, covering everything from which plants were edible to how to predict weather changes by watching cloud formations. "You really love this country?" Sarah observed during their midday rest beside a small creek. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the red rock formations that rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor. "It gets in your blood after a while. The silence, the space, the way it challenges you to become stronger than you thought you could be. My wife used to say that city folk spent so much time looking at walls that they forgot how big the world really is." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Sarah said gently. Would have liked you, I think. She always said the best adventures come from following your instincts instead of other people's expectations." As they traveled deeper into New Mexico territory, Sarah began to understand what Jake meant about the country changing people. The endless sky and rugged landscape demanded a different kind of awareness, a readiness to adapt and respond that her structured Boston life had never required. She found herself becoming more attuned to small details, the direction of the wind, the behavior of birds, the subtle changes in the terrain that might indicate safety or danger. On their third day together, they came upon a sight that stopped both horses in their tracks. A small wagon sat beside the trail, one wheel broken and its contents scattered across the ground. A middle-aged man sat in the shade of the disabled vehicle, his head in his hands. While a woman who was clearly his wife tried to comfort him, Jake dismounted immediately and approached the couple. "Folks, looks like you could use some help." "Eh?" Man looked up with relief written across his weathered face. "Thank God, I was beginning to think we'd die out here. Name's Tom Henderson. This is my wife, Mary. We're heading to Santa Fe, but hit a rock and snapped the axle yesterday morning." Sarah climbed down from Stella and went to comfort Mary Henderson, who was clearly frightened and exhausted. The woman grabbed Sarah's hands gratefully. "We've been sitting here for a day and a half," Mary said, her voice shaking. Heard his. "Back trying to fix the wheel, and we're almost out of water." Jake was already examining the broken wagon with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to solving practical problems. "The axle's completely snapped," he told Tom. "Can't fix it with what we've got here. But there's a trading post about 15 miles south. They'll have replacement parts." 15 miles might as well be 1,500, Tom said bitterly. "I can barely walk with this back, and Mary's never been on a horse in her life." Sarah looked at Jake, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. They couldn't simply leave these people stranded in the desert, but helping them would significantly delay their journey. "We'll take you to the trading post," Sarah said before Jake could speak. "Mary can ride with me, and Tom can use Jake's horse." "I can't ask you to do that," Tom protested. "You don't even know us." "Out here, we help each other," Jake said simply. Echoing something Sarah was learning was a fundamental rule of frontier life. That's how everyone survives. It took most of the day to reach the trading post, a rough collection of buildings surrounding a well that served travelers crossing the desert. The owner, a grizzled man named Pete Kowalski, welcomed them warmly and immediately set about organizing repairs for the Hendersons' wagon. "You folks can stay the night," Pete offered. "Got rooms out back, and Mary there can cook us all a proper dinner. Been eating my own cooking for 2 weeks now, and it's enough to kill a man." That evening, as they sat around Pete's table sharing a meal of venison stew and cornbread, Sarah found herself thinking about how different this experience was from anything her old life had offered. In Boston, she might have passed 100 strangers on the street without speaking to any of them. Here, people who had never met before became temporary family, sharing food, shelter, and stories with the easy generosity that harsh country seemed to inspire. Jake noticed her contemplative mood and drew her aside after dinner. "Having second thoughts about the adventure?" "Just the opposite," Sarah replied. "I'm beginning to understand what I've been missing all these years. In Boston, I was so focused on following rules and meeting expectations that I never learned what I was capable of when those boundaries were removed." "And what are you discovering about yourself?" Jake asked, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the fear-allayed Sarah considered the question seriously. "That I'm stronger than I thought, more resourceful, and ... She paused, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. More willing to take risks that my old self would have found terrifying. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. Jake reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and gently touched her cheek. "Sarah, I need you to know that these past few days have meant more to me than I expected. When I offered to escort you to Arizona, I thought I was just helping someone in need. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about protection and started being about something else entirely." Sarah's heart was beating so fast, she was sure he could hear it. Everything about this moment, the desert stars overhead, the warmth of Jake's hand against her skin, the intensity in his eyes, was exactly the kind of romantic adventure she had dreamed about but never believed could happen to someone like her. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that maybe fate had bigger plans than either of us realized when we met in that Denver saloon." Sarah felt the world shift as Jake's words hung in the air. Her rational mind warned her to pull back, to keep the boundaries she'd set. But her heart was already answering a question Jake hadn't asked aloud. Before she could speak, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. They turned toward the trail as a group of riders emerged. Pete Kowalski stepped out of the trading post, rifle ready. "Evening, gentlemen," Pete called. "Post's closed, but the well's yours." The lead rider, a silver-mustached man in fine clothes, tipped his hat. "Colonel James Brennan. We're tracking stolen cattle. Seen any herds recently?" Jake's hand drifted toward his gun. Sarah tensed beside him, sensing something was off. "Haven't seen any?" Pete replied evenly. The colonel's gaze lingered on Sarah, traveling with any livestock. Jake answered, "Just horses and a mule." "We're escorting the lady to Arizona territory. A dangerous place for a woman," Brennan said with a cold smile. "We can take care of ourselves," Sarah replied, her instincts prickling. After the riders disappeared into the dark, Pete stayed watchful a while longer. "Something about those men didn't sit right with me," he said. "That wasn't a search party," Jake agreed. "They moved like a military unit. Could be something more organized." That night, Sarah lay awake, her thoughts tangled between Jake and the ominous encounter. What began as a journey of independence was quickly turning into something deeper, more dangerous and far more personal. By morning, Tom Henderson's wagon was ready. Before they parted ways, Mary Henderson pulled Sarah aside. "That man of yours," Mary said with a knowing look. "He's fallen hard." Sarah blushed. "He's not my man." Mary chuckled. "Honey, I know. Love when I see it. Question is, what do you plan to do about it?" Before Sarah could respond, Jake approached, concern in his eyes. "We need to talk." Behind the trading post, Jake shared troubling news. A freighter had reported raids near Emma's Ranch. Apache attacks, settlers fleeing, and a group calling itself the Arizona Land Company, LAGEDLY, forcing ranchers to sell, cheap, under threat. 3 ranchers dead in the last month, Jake said. Could be hired guns behind it, not Apache. Sarah's heart sank. Emma was alone with 2 children. Anything could have happened since that letter. "We need to get there fast," she said. Jake nodded. "But understand, if it's true, we'll be riding into real danger." They said goodbye to Pete and the Hendersons and rode into Arizona. The landscape shifted, greener, more mountainous, streams and pine groves replacing desert dust. Under different circumstances, Sarah would have been enchanted, but fear for Emma pushed her forward. Shortening rest stops despite Jake's concern. On their 3rd day, they found a burned cabin near a creek. Livestock lay dead, and the ruins still smoldered. Jake walked through the wreckage, then returned, grim-faced. "This wasn't Apache," he said. "Livestock's untouched. They weren't stealing, they were sending a message." "What kind of message? Sell your land or this happens to you?" They rode in silence, both dreading what lay ahead. That evening they camped in a sheltered canyon over beans and hardtack. Sarah studied Jake in the firelight. In the past week, he had proven himself in ways no man back east ever had, not just with skill and strength, but with respect. He challenged her ideas, encouraged her independence, and never once treated her as fragile. "Jake," she asked softly, "what happens after we reach Emma's ranch?" He looked up. "What do you mean? Will you go back to Colorado? Pretend this journey never happened?" Jake was quiet, poking at the fire. "That depends on what you want. This was your adventure. I'm just along for the ride." She met his gaze. "What if I don't want you to go back?" He froze, then slowly sat beside her. "What are you saying?" Sarah took a breath. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe this is more than just courtesy. Jake's expression was serious but hopeful. "I've tried to keep my feelings in check. You needed space to find yourself." "And how do you feel?" she asked. He reached for her hand. "I think I started falling for you the moment you said you'd spend one night in every town between Denver and Arizona. That courage, it stunned me." Sarah blinked back tears. "I thought you saw me as another helpless city girl." Shook his head. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." She leaned closer. So what now? Jake smiled. Now we get to Emma. We help her deal with the trouble. And then we figure out what comes next together. Under a sky ablaze. With stars, Sarah leaned into the warmth of Jake's arms. Knowing her one night of adventure had become something far greater than she ever dreamed. The next morning, Sarah and Jake rode toward Emma's ranch with a mixture of anticipation and dread. According to Jake's calculations, they should reach the property before midday, but the closer they got, the more signs of trouble they encountered. Abandoned homesteads dotted the landscape, their empty windows staring out at the Arizona mountains like hollow eyes. There, Jake said, pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from a valley ahead. That should be your cousin's place. Sarah urged Stella into a faster pace, her heart racing with worry. The smoke could mean anything, a normal cooking fire, a controlled burn, or something much worse, as they crested the ridge overlooking the valley. She pulled her horse to a stop and stared down at the scene below. Emma's ranch house stood intact but barely. The barn had been partially burned, and several outbuildings were nothing but charred ruins. Cattle lay scattered across the pastures, and the fencing had been cut in multiple places. A small group of people moved around the property, but from this distance, Sarah couldn't tell if they were family or strangers. "Stay close to me," Jake said quietly, checking his rifle. "We don't know who's down there or what their intentions might be." They rode down the slope cautiously. Jake positioned slightly ahead of Sarah with his hand resting on his weapon as they approached the ranch house. A woman emerged from behind the building, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Sarah." The voice was unmistakably Emma's, filled with relief and disbelief. "Oh my God, Sarah, you came." Sarah dismounted quickly and ran to embrace her cousin. Emma looked older than her 28 years, her face gaunt with worry in her clothes, showing the strain of hard work and little sleep. But her eyes lit up with joy as she held Sarah tight. "I got your letter," Sarah said, fighting back tears. "I'm so sorry about William, and I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner." "You're here now, that's what matters," Emma replied, then looked past Sarah to where Jake sat on his horse. "Who's your friend?" Sarah realized she had never fully explained Jake's presence in any of her letters. "This is Jake Morrison. He's been escorting me from Colorado." "Jake, this is my cousin Emma." Jake dismounted and touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am, sorry for your losses. Looks like you've had some serious trouble here." Emma's expression darkened. "Trouble doesn't begin to describe it. Come inside, both of you. There's a lot you need to know, and it's not safe to talk out in the open." The ranch house showed signs of hasty barricading, furniture pushed against windows, rifle ports cut into shutters, and a general atmosphere of people preparing for siege. Emma led them to the kitchen, where two children sat at a scarred wooden table. Sarah recognized her young cousins from photographs Emma had sent years earlier, but both Tommy and little Grace looked far too serious for their ages. "Children, this is your Aunt Sarah from Boston," Emma said gently. "The one I told you about." Tommy, who was 8, studied Sarah with solemn eyes. "Are you here to help us fight the bad men?" Sarah looked at Emma in alarm. "Bad men?" Emma poured coffee for her adult guest and milk for the children before settling into her own chair with a weary sigh. "3 weeks after I wrote to you, men claiming to represent something called the Arizona Land Company showed up here. They made an offer to buy the ranch for about a quarter of what it's worth, saying I'd be wise to accept, given that a woman alone couldn't possibly manage such a place. I take it you refused," Jake said. "Of course I refused. This ranch is all my children have left of their father." But these men made it clear that refusal wasn't really an option. They said accidents had been happening to people who weren't reasonable. About business propositions, Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. What kind of accidents? "The kind that look like Apache raids but aren't," Emma replied bitterly. 3 neighboring ranchers have been killed in the past month. Their families were told it was Indian trouble, but there's been no Apache activity in this area for over 2 years. The attacks always happen to people who've refused to sell to the land company. Jake leaned forward intently. "Have you seen these men since the first visit?" "Twice. They come back every few days to ask if I've reconsidered. Each time, they seem a little less patient with my answer." Yesterday they told me I had until the end of the week to make my decision. That's tomorrow, Sarah said, her blood running cold. Emma nodded. I was going to pack up the children tonight and leave for town. I can't protect them here by myself, and I won't risk their lives for any amount of land. Sarah looked around. The kitchen that represented Emma's entire life, the home she had built with her husband, the legacy she wanted to leave her children. The thought of her cousin being driven away by threats and violence made her furious. You shouldn't have to leave, she said firmly. This is your home, your land. There has to be something we can do. Jake had been listening quietly, but now he spoke with the authority of someone familiar with frontier conflicts. Emma, these land company men, how many of them are there? I've seen 4 different ones, but they talk like there are more. The leader is a man who calls himself Colonel Brennan. Sarah and Jake exchanged significant glances. The same man who had approached them at Pete's trading post, claiming to be tracking stolen cattle. We've met the colonel, Jake said grimly. He was asking questions about travelers in the area, probably trying to figure out if anyone might interfere with his plans. Emma looked between them with growing hope. You think there's something we can do? Jake stood up and walked to the window, studying the surrounding terrain with the eye of a military strategist. Maybe, but it would be dangerous, and there are no guarantees. These men are obviously willing to use violence to get what they want. What are you thinking? Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected what Jake was considering. I'm thinking that bullies usually depend on their victims being isolated and helpless, Jake replied. Colonel Brennan and his men are used to intimidating people who have no support and no way to fight back. They might not be prepared to deal with organized resistance. Emma's eyes brightened with the first real hope Sarah had seen since arriving. I mean, make it clear that you're not as defenseless as they think, Jake said. But Emma, you need to understand the risks. If we resist these men and fail, the consequences for you and your children could be severe. Sarah stood up decisively. Then we don't fail. Both Jake and Emma looked at her in surprise. I didn't travel 1,500 miles to watch my cousin be driven from her home by thugs. Sarah continued, feeling the strength she had discovered during her journey crystallizing into determination. Emma, this ranch is your children's inheritance. It's wrong to let criminals steal it through fear and violence. Jake smiled at her with obvious admiration and pride. So what do you propose we do? Sarah looked around the kitchen, her mind working rapidly. The proper Boston lady would have counseled retreat and legal remedies that would take months or years to implement. But Sarah was no longer that woman. The frontier had taught her that sometimes immediate action was the only effective response to immediate threats. We make them understand that this ranch is defended, she said with growing confidence. And we make sure they know that any violence against this family will have serious consequences. Emma leaned forward eagerly. How? Sarah smiled, feeling the same thrill of adventure that had started her journey in Denver. We set a trap. As the 3 adults began planning their strategy, little Grace looked up from her milk and asked innocently, Are we going to win? Knelt down beside her young cousin and took her small hands in hers. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to win. Because sometimes the good people have to stand up to the bad people. When they do it together, they're much stronger than anyone expects. Outside, the Arizona sun climbed higher in the sky, and somewhere in the distance, Colonel Brennan and his men were making their own plans. But inside the ranch house, 3 determined adults and 2 brave children were preparing to show them that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the odds.